Hello, my name is Sarah Tangren. I work at the Home and Garden Information Center, University of Maryland Extension. I will be the moderator for this webinar. Welcome to Landscape Maintenance Practices for Native Bees. It is one of the many webinars we are offering in the Focus on Sustainability series. A bit of background. The series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally in the United States for their quality education programs. We are working together to expand the reach of these education programs through our webinar series. In case you were not familiar with these organizations, all nonprofit, largely volunteer groups, they are the Ecological Landscape Alliance in the Northeast U.S., the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council in the Washington, D.C. area, and Ecolandscape California. Our speaker today, Sam Droege, is a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. He has coordinated the North American Breeding Bird Survey Program, developed the North American Amphibian Monitoring Program, the BioBlitz, the Cricket Crawl, and Frog Watch USA programs. Currently, he is developing an inventory and monitoring program for native bees, online identification guides for North American bees at discoverlife.org, and with Jessica Zelf, he is reviving the North American Bird Phenology program. His laboratory group is famous for their stunning high-resolution macro photographs of insects. Sam is also the author of a new book called Bees, an up-close look at pollinators around the world. He holds a bachelor's from University of Maryland and an MS from State University of New York at Syracuse. Sam?
Thank you. Let's get that going. Well, it's good to be here, and it's good to talk to landscapers because, as I think you'll see when we talk through the PowerPoint slides here, that the primary conservation avenue for conserving and increasing the number of bees, bringing back some of the biodiversity that's been lost, is mediated completely through the plants that are out there. And as landscapers, you're going to have different choices to make as to what you plant, how things are maintained, and what you're going to do when you talk to different landowners. So let me get started here. So the first thing, so I just want to also emphasize there's lots of details here. So the 4,000 different species of bees in North America also means that there's 4,000 things like honeybees, equally as interesting, equally as varied, equally as diverse, and we're not going to get into really almost any of that. It's all going to be about the plants and the plantings, and you don't need to, although to be a more well-rounded person, of course, you would want to look into more of the bee biology there, but we're going to emphasize the role of plants and the native bee populations. So I have to actually start with honeybees because that's the model bee that almost everyone knows, particularly landowners. And the easiest way to think about them in terms of their relationship to native species, i.e. as models, is that everything that you know about honeybees does not occur in native bees. So you can just eliminate all the questions by saying that they're not at all like honeybees. There's no barbed stings, there's no queens, long-term queens rather, there's no honey, there's no honeycomb. We can go on down the list, and anything that you know about honeybees is pretty much absent. They're highly specialized, not native, primarily an Asian group. We brought one over. They're a domesticated animal, much more analogous to chickens and cattle than really to a native bee species. We have introduced bees. I'm not going to talk about them at all. They're a very minor component of most of our environments. So that's sort of the analog. So everything else is radically different. And so all the issues with stinging, which I think might be, yeah. So here's another big one for lots of people. When you're talking to them, they are automatically going to bring up, well, what about stinging, or my child's allergic? There's always one person who has an allergic child in the room. And the answer is that about a quarter of all the native bees, by the way, only females sting, but about a quarter of the females have a sting that's so ineffective that it can't penetrate our skin, so rendering them essentially stingless to us. The remaining are not bees that defend their nests, with the exception of if you disturb a bumblebee nest. Some of those species will, of course, give you some sharp kisses, but the other native species are all solitary moms, or in small groups. You can literally dig up or lie among their bee nests and their aggregations, and most people are walking across their nests all the time in their gardens, because the population density for native bee species in any environment that has any amount of floral resource is huge. And so we don't have stinging issues. Let's also point out that people will then tell you, like, well, I was mowing my grass, or I was working in the garden, all these bees came out of the ground and stung me. Those are never bees. They're always yellow jackets, which are wasps. And people can be highly allergic to yellow jackets. And there's interesting stories as to why colonial species cause allergy attacks and the solitaries do not, but our native species do not. And even our stinging insects are not a threat when you're dealing with plantings, because they don't defend flowers ever. Now, if you catch one in your hand, why you would do that, I don't know, then if it was the right species, it would give you a sting. But even when the native species do sting you, they don't have that reactivity component to them. So, more background. United States, about 4,000 species. We know so little about many of them that we don't even have names for about 10%. So a lot of these are estimates. California, about 2,000. Texas, 1,000. East of the Mississippi, 800. Note that we have a lot more species to the west of the Mississippi, and that includes a lot of eastern species that bleed over there. That's because much of our biodiversity is centered on the desert areas of the Southwest. Lots of plant specialization, lots of ranges divided by mountain borders and basins, and the complexity of the plant community is mirrored in the complexity of the bee community. But still, in the east, Maryland, tiny state, no one knows their name out west anyway, but is 400, and we're now up to about 450 species. This is an out-of-date slide. In the county that I live in, 252 species. It's the richest county in Maryland in terms of number of species, really only because I live there. Another sort of illustration of how little we know, because very few people actually look at bees, because mostly it's a catch them and look at them under the microscope situation. In contrast, the United Kingdom, those tiny islands off the coast of Europe, have only about 250 species on them, so less than the county that we're talking from right now. So here's the world, the natural world without bees, and here is an example of things that have been taken from the natural world and put into a shop that shows the world with bees. So flower and color are things that have been designed by the plant and bee world together to create an effective system for bees to locate plants of the right type. So when you're looking at this slide, and obviously any floral shop or any of the gardeners' gardens, you'll see all these different flower types and colors and shapes. That's there for a reason, and you'll see over the next few slides when I show you just examples of different native species that the architecture of our native species is extremely varied. It's not at all like the honeybee, for example, and their sizes and shapes are like lock and key for some of these floral shapes. The modifications we make to them by the breeders is small compared to the modifications that have occurred over many thousands, millions of years, really, while these things developed. So one wonders that without bees, how many gardeners and gardening clubs would, cease to exist. So more things to thank bees for there than just simply fruits. So I just want you to look at these pictures and note the variation. Scales are really different This last one was, you know, the size of half a grain of rice. Other things are much larger than honeybees. Some are, like this one, are analogous to in size to our bumblebees. They're doing all sorts of different things. Just looking at the tongues, you can see that there are huge differences in how they're accessing the pollen and nectar out of these plants by, you know, what kind of equipment they've decided to put into what we call a tongue, but is something quite different in terms of bee morphology. And I also think that the colors and sizes and shapes are equally subtle and beautiful, and the palettes they being anthropomorphic, the bees use is also as exquisite as the flowers. We just don't resolve a lot of this detail when we're looking at them as we come to our gardens. They're also eminently visible with a pair of butterfly or up-close binoculars, and much easier to see than birds and butterflies, not to knock those two categories of animals. So as you can see, my little bit tongue-in-cheek slide here, I'm just going to mention in passing that the primary cause of bee decline, not really based on data, this is a slide showing declines in bobwhite quail, for example, which we do track well, but it also points out this fact that we're losing a lot of in the east, successional habitats, but even in the west, we're seeing landscapes that are becoming highly treed or highly agricultural or urbanized and suburbanized. And we're losing transitional habitats which house many of these bee species. So here's a place that landscapers can come into play, because bees are not large. We're not talking about reintroducing bison into people's backyards or their properties. This is a system that can be recovered at very small scales. You know, a quarter acre can support many different kinds of bee species, for example, if it's planted correctly. And so we have in our professions the ability to help with recovery and at least augmenting the surrounding natural areas in a much better way than planting some of the, you know, the basic foundation evergreens and the plastic plants from overbred hybrid tea roses and the things that don't really support pollinators anymore. So the problem is that our landscape is losing flowers because bees are dependent on pollen. So every bee species, there are many which are parasitic, they all feed their young a mixture of pollen and nectar or pollen and oils. And so it's all about flowers. So the more flowers you have, automatically the greater the bee density you will get. And we'll talk about this in slightly detail. I hope you can't hear the phone ringing while we're talking, but if you can, so be it. We have two sort of ends of the spectrum in terms of how bees interact with plants. We have generalists, like here's Algochloropsis metallica, that collected off of tomato plant right here in Laurel, Maryland. And then we have a series of specialists. All bees have preferences, even honeybees, bumblebees do too, in terms of what flowers they prefer to feed on. The bees, and as a very succinct part of the story, that are out all year long are much more generalists because their plant communities come and go. And others are highly specialized and only out during the time that their plant species or species group is out. And I'll give you some examples. There are many examples, and I'll have a link somewhere in here, and we'll have links available through, I think Penny will send out via email, and on the website will be information about how to get more information about specialist plants housing specialist bees. And I'm happy to send papers too. You'll see my email address at the end. So just a few examples. Again, huge amount of information and stories are behind these things that we have no time to go in. But think about willows. A lot of people don't even think of willows as blooming trees. They're dioecious, so males and females on separate plants. They tend to be long-term. There's a lot of willow communities that have been there for centuries in these wetlands. And there are, in Maryland, there's 8 different species of bees that only collect pollen from willow trees. And it's a very nice system. The willows bloom early in the spring. They have innocuous flowers because they don't really need to have flowers that are very colorful to attract things from far away because their bees simply nest in the ground nearby them. And each year they come out, there's the willow, they gather the pollen nectar, create new nests in the ground. And this cycle continues. Willows bloom early in the spring to cut down on the thievery by other insects that like the pollen and nectar that they produce. Again, I'm leaving out tons of details. Here's a very different system. Lysimachias, or native Lysimachias, or native loosestrife plants, not things like purple loosestrife, are oil producers. So they're not producing a nectar as a gift to the bees to attract them to the plant. They're producing oils, and one group of bees, the Macropus, are specialists only on loosestrifes. So no loosestrifes, no Macropus bees. Sorry, they don't have common names. But that's just another peek at some of this complexity. Many wetland plants, water lilies and a variety of other things, are heavy-duty pollen attracting, bee attracting, they don't attract pollen, bee attracting plants with their pollen. Pickleweed is a fun example. So here's a plant that completely disappears underwater in the winter. In the summer, it sends up a series of giant purple spikes. Think of that as a long distance signal. Hey, I've got pollen and nectar out here when you come for a visit. The bees spot that, come out, but it turns out that the Pontidaria is also tricking the other bee species because it really only wants a set of 3 different species that are specialists, that have extra long tongues to get down the florets and have hairs that are hooked at the end that allow the pollen that can only be extracted, or maybe only efficiently extracted, by a bee with a long tongue with hooked hairs on it. The rest of the bees have straight hairs. They would nest then on the banks nearby. But, you know, there's a system that evolved over many, many thousands of years. Enotherans, so evening primroses of different types. Why do they bloom in the evening? Well, there's a whole set of specialist bees, many, many different kinds from many different groups, not one genus of bee. It's many different genera of bees have evolved to come out in the evening, and also to deal with the super sticky byssal threads that gum up the pollen, so that most other insects, including other bees, really can't deal with this nasty, gooey mass. They have a very simplified set of pollen-carrying hairs, and in addition to only coming out in the evening, which is, again, this little hook that the evening primroses do to decrease the amount of competition for their pollen and nectar, which they've spent tons of plant money on, right? So the last thing they want is to have something just simply eat the pollen and nectar and not move the pollen around for to meet their pollination needs. So some plant families are extremely rich in bees that have specialized relationships with those plants, often on almost nearly single species basis. So Asteraceae, the bees that you see down below, all different sizes and shapes, many different even families within there, have many, many plants, particularly the fall ones, that have bees that only come to them. If you look at the chemistry of these plants, a lot of times there's a whole long list of secondary compounds that make the pollen and nectar, or the pollen really, not so much the nectar, bitter or distasteful to many bees, or downright unpalatable, that the specialist bees have the ability to digest and extract the nutrients from. So just an aside, pollen is really, from a bee's point of view, is made of the interior of the pollen, which is often hard to break down. The pollen body is really tough. And then the pollen kit, which you can think of as bee glue, that the plant has surrounded the pollen with, which contains tons of lipids and proteins and whatever else it wants to put in there, including some chemical warfare in lots of cases. Another big group is the ericaceous plants. So even within vaccinium, depending on how you define vaccinium these days, so deerberry has different things from blueberry, and you find very different groups of families that are on there. Some, like cranberry, has its own set of specialists. So it's really an interesting and varied sort of situation. So from your point of view, putting words in your mouth, the issue here is that not all flowers are created equal. So a lot of the lists currently that you'll see for these are plants that attract bees are really insufficient in my mind to do what we would like to do, which is to lift all bees, the conservation and the long-term survival of all these different species, because a lot of times the species that are listed are not native, and so they may be attractive to the generalist bees, but this is similar to you're not going to save all the birds by putting out bird feeders. You're going to save a bunch of crows and sparrows who don't really need to be saving. So it's fun to look at bird feeders, though, as it's fun to look at a lot of the mints. You know, think of mountain mint and whatever your analog is in your region. That attracts a lot of bees. A lot of times those are mostly generalists or other specialists who come for a drink of nectar. Those are great, but when you're choosing from your list, and I'll show you a link to our website, you really want to choose, in my mind, from the specialist list of plants that have specialists first, and try and plant those out. I wouldn't worry at this point because it gets really complicated quickly. You know, the coverage the idea would be to have bloom coverage throughout the year, choosing from a variety of these different specialist bee plants, and then add in your mountain mints and other kinds of things that make great displays and fit other needs that you might have for your particular situation. And the reason to focus on them is that if you don't have that plant, you don't have those bees. They're the most vulnerable bees. They're the ones that are rare. They have to deal with all sorts of other losses within their environment that impact the plant group that they're associated with, anything from deer to loss of habitat to, you know, there's a very long list of things that impact plants, and those are the things that impact bees. Bees really have relatively little issues with pesticides and loss of nesting habitat, for example, compared to loss of plants and plant diversity in our environment. So here's the URL. It might be up there too slowly. Maybe you can take a screenshot, but we'll give you access to that URL in the resources later. So the equation is pretty simple. Plant biodiversity equals bee biodiversity. You don't even have to pay attention to the specialist list. If you just focus on, as much as possible, providing the landscape or populating any kind of landscape from bedding plants to whatever with nativars being better than cultivars, because anytime you augment any aspect of a bee in a plant breeding program, some of that energy is probably being stolen from the pollen and nectar, side of the spreadsheet. Because
okay, I think you mean local ecotypes or ecotypes who are better than nativars, because nativars are cultivars.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I'm using poor language. Yes, it's as much as possible. Retain the wild types of plants from your local environment and use those seed stocks and plants in your work. And just as an aside, in terms of bee biodiversity, you're also bringing in biodiversity of all sorts that we really pay almost no attention to, and culturally we know little about, all the other insect groups that are also highly specialized on different native species of plants, and down to fungi and viruses, and you're propagating an entire small ecosystem with each of those native plants that are brought along. And certainly right now, the easiest way that's expressed, and because we spend a little more time focusing on pollinators, although as I pointed out, we know relatively little compared to birds or vertebrates, that they all have lots of specialization in the world. So you're doing lots of good even if you don't know it. That makes any sense. So in addition to landscapes that might be planted or where you're actually physically doing something, then another point here is that native habitats, all else being equal, are going to have the most rich and biodiverse and best environments, and that a lot of times the better approach or a good approach is to augment what's already there and, eliminating, doing the usual kinds of things of controlling deer and eliminating invasive plants, and then looking at working with the reserve of native blooming plants that are in that area. Another issue, something that I'm sure you guys have talked about quite a bit, is the issue of aesthetics. And it's not really played out very explicitly in very many places, but particularly when you're in a suburban / urban area, some of the issues have to do with the appearances of a unkempt, let's call it, group of native plants, particularly if you're trying to restore a lawn or do something with that. So, your neighbors can get extremely irritated with that if the presentation is not very good, or they think that you're perhaps have passed away in your house and you're forgotten that things need to be mowed. Maybe they'll mow it for you while you're not there. A couple of things I've learned from other groups is that the key here is that when people think about landscapes, what they want to see is that all the man-made objects in a landscape are really well taken care of and that they're trimmed out. So the house has to have more or less formal foundation plantings, and any sidewalks and driveways and the roadsides in particular needs to have a very nice trimmed edge, with the string trimmer and edgers and things like that. And then whatever happens, and fences too, and anything that happens on the interior is, pretty much seen as like your option. But it's clear that you, the landowner, are taking care of your property and that you are, you did this on purpose. They may not get it, but it's acceptable. So I think a lot more effort in the future needs to be spent on making some of these kinds of plantings in where the human interface is greater, and this includes in parks and other things too, because of the fear of ticks and whatnot. That these edging and weed trimming is a really an integral part of this. And even if you are converting lawn, not all the lawn needs to be converted to really to do good. And the aesthetic and the thinking about your neighbors is also a good part of that. So I'm on top of my house and I'm looking at this little straw bale guest house that we built. And here's an example from my page of the book, which is maybe a little more extreme than most people are interested in. But when I moved in, I had an acre of lawn, and I've been converting that to various, mostly experimental patches of like, how can I, convert this lawn? What if I plant this? What if I burn little patches and so forth? So I play around with my yard an awful lot. But one sort of insight that I've had is that I have a lawnmower, but it's sat there for 3 years now in my shed, and I just have completely converted to using a good quality string trimmer, which I can put a brush blade on. So I can create then all these really interesting kind of path types. I can create small patches of lawn. It takes relatively little time to do that. And I can also at the same time really create nice, neat trim edgings to, whatever house feature that I'm doing that on, without having to also get out the string trimmer after using the mower. I also use the string trimmer as an editor, so I can, which you can't do with really a lawnmower. If I see a plant coming up inside an area that I planted, I can take the string trimmer and usually with very little effort, cut out the small trees that are growing up or some invasive plant. And I may not be herbiciding it, but I usually can knock them back enough that their ability to recover is low or they're insignificant in terms of competition with everything else. As one aside, last year this isn't what not to do. I like to burn little sections of these. They have paths that cut off the different burn things. And I thought, oh, I don't have much time this spring. I'm just going to burn the whole yard at once. So I just went around lighting fires. It was a lot of fun. And then I noticed that on one side of the house that had gotten into an area that I had put down a lot of wood chips, and like, oh my God, that's too much, too hot. I'm going to burn off too much mulch. So I'm working on that. And I come back, and that little house that you see in the picture, that was on fire. And and so I was able to beat it out, and it was kind of a horrific thing. So that's just sort of fun tip. Don't burn your whole yard at the same time, particularly when you're not allowed to. So, and then the nice thing about the brush blade, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, is that with the brush blade, you can really quickly trim down woody plants, like take back the brambles. And surrounding my house are woodlands with lots of invasive multiflora rose and bayberry. Those things just make short work of all these kinds of plants that you struggle with. And I really don't have to use herbicides or anything anymore because I just knock them back each year, and they become, again, an insignificant, although maybe still present, component to parts of the community. But I also can take down all the perennials and other annuals at the end of the year and make for something that looks somewhat neat and tidy. So here's an example. There's that little house again. But you see how I've edged out a lot of the pathways and the man-made objects there. And then I sort of decide on an ad hoc basis what I'm going to leave and what I'm not. Here's a bunch of daisy fleabane and other things, which probably is not native, but it was like,
oh, it is.
Oh, it is.
I love daisy fleabane.
Sarah likes daisy fleabane. So good job, Sam, without thinking about it. But that's the fun thing, is if I didn't like that, I could take it out in a second without having to take out my cutters or dig it out. The string trimmer really works well. And then I can keep it from coming back by just simply trimming it. There's a lot of information about planting. So a lot of people talk about mason bees or bee hotels of different kinds, and just Google search images of bee hotels and you'll see all kinds of really cool things. There's really a set of points here, and everything else is art. One is you either are going to drill dead wood, never live wood, because the plant will heal that back up or plug it back up, or use small diameter tubed plants. So bamboo, Phragmites, dead Phragmites is an awesome plant. You just cut bundles of Phragmites, wire them every foot, cut between the wires, and you instantly have tons of bee nesting habitat that you can put into cups or cans or a variety of ways. Everything else is just drilling holes in wood. I drill holes in my neighbor's fence posts all the time with their permission, but you can, and I also drill the porch posts on my house because I like seeing them around. There's lots that can be done, and different size diameters and different depths of bits are something to play with. There's another whole, there's groups of people who obsess over these kinds of habitats, you know, try and put in paper tubes and worry about the fact that there are native parasites and predators that come in, and, you know, they love, we got a high density of bees, you're going to have a high density of parasites and predators. I would say don't worry about it, because almost no one is willing to really keep up the work that's necessary. And most people are doing that work based on what commercial people do who, you know, grow mason bees for a living and take them out into orchards and places like that. So, so don't worry about it. So the better is to have these mason bee things near where you live. So you want to walk by it each day, or if it's a visitor's center, you want to have it walk right by. It's not a stinging issue. You want people to be looking at what's going on, not to have them tucked away in the backyard. It's also, while nice, it's not going to be critical for your bees. There's bee habitat around. Usually bees will find a place to nest. This is nice. About 5% of the bee species use these kinds of things. Most are ground nesters. And here's another thing that can be done that brings back the end of the year trimming. So Sarah mentioned this to me, and other people have too. They worry about their native bee or their native plant gardens in relationship to trimming off the dead stalks each year, with the notion that you're trimming out a whole bunch of bee nests, and you're, you know, basically, you know, tiny baby bees are being abandoned and destroyed in that process. Well, the answer is they're not. And the reason is that the bees that nest in the stems of these perennials are bees that, unlike carpenter bees, cannot penetrate those stems on their own. They don't have mandibles that are strong enough to break through the plant wall and get to the pith or the hollow interiors. So without getting into a lot of details, the best thing to do is, at whatever point in the winter you think you are ready, or you're like the birds have eaten all the seeds, just go in with your brush blade or clippers and clip everything off to be about a foot high. What that does is it opens up the pists for bees to nest in the spring. And remember, there's a multi-year cycle going on. Bees nest in year 1, and then the young hatch out in year 2, and the plants had to grow in year -1. So by cutting everything a foot high each year, you are maintaining quite a bit of bee nesting housing. And what this shows on the screen here, I think maybe only partially, is what I do, and you certainly can do a better job than I do, is I take all those cuttings and I weave them between sticks or stakes and sort of make a impromptu garden wall from those, and those ends also become nesting, condominiums for different bee species. So that's something that Sarah has told me has kept relationships at her house and maybe other people's houses in when you have someone who says, "Can't you trim up that garden a little bit? It's looking untidy." Well, tidy is good in some cases.
You've made my husband very happy.
See, look at that. I should get into counseling. So here's another aspect, which is you should bring in children so that they dig out holes and dirt in your yard. In general, like the traditional thing is that you don't want any bare soil, both from an aesthetic point of view and also from the fact that a lot of bare soil can yield erosion. Usually it has to be a huge amount of bare soil that is an erosion issue. But if you were a bee, a lot of bees love this sparse kind of open soil. Sometimes they even prefer hard-packed soil. So like a pathway is often a bee nesting area for some species. And other species favor sparse grassy soil that maybe is dry. Like if you have a sandy lawn, a lot of times you can get huge bee aggregations. Remember, they don't sting in these sites. So you can build that in, or you can just not worry about it because, again, bees usually find places to nest. But in general, having some spots tucked away, aesthetic or not, that have bare soil is actually a good thing. Cliff faces of clay are even better. There's some bees that, they nest in cliff faces, and some are quite good. A flatland analog to that is if you have woods and you have wind-thrown trees, the root masses are automatically bee nesting areas. So Sidwell Friend School, Washington, D.C., middle of the super urban area. There is nothing around there that is native habitat, and even their playing field is based on an old dump. I've worked with I knew the teachers there, and for years they have done little surveys of bees with their students. They're up to 84 species. My point here is that they haven't done anything crazy good for native plants per se, but almost any area, urban or not, has access to lots and lots of native bees, and they're constantly coursing over any region looking for a place to nest. So if you plant ironweed in the DC area, you will get the ironweed specialist, even if there's not one for half a mile in the area. So again, you don't have to worry about bringing bees. So some of these osmias and other species you can buy online don't. It's introducing potentially genetic material that's inappropriate. You can put in nests for those if you want, but your main job is to create and plant the appropriate types of plants for the area, and the bees will come and find it, and it will be a delightful biodiversity hotspots for bees very quickly. All right, I'm skipping this because we talked about that a little bit. Very simple, practical advice for anyone who doesn't quite know what they want to do with the landscape at the time, because these transitional habitats are the ones that we're most concerned about. We're really not concerned about woodlands because there's actually plenty of those in most places. So mow once a year in March is with your brush hog set at about foot high, again, for the same reasons, creates bee nesting habitat for some of those species, is a good technique. And then everything else is the many, many other kinds of approaches and tools that you guys use to selectively herbicide or plant in things that you want to see in a native plant and therefore a native bee community in those areas. Just to add some gasoline to that fire, so EPA has estimated that 5% of all air pollution is generated by lawn care activities of different kinds. So anytime you are involved in mowing or you want to advise people about mowing, you know, they should realize what they're doing is mowing flowers and decreasing bee habitat just to make them feel a little more guilty in there for lots of reasons.
Sam, I want to remind everybody that's listening that we only have a few slides left, so if you want to get your questions into that question box, that would be great.
Yep. Again, very general advice, particularly in the East, but I think this goes pretty much anywhere. We want to be thinking more when we're talking about restoration or what to do with land that's not, you know, going to be used for ag or development, conservation lands, to be planting meadows rather than trees. You will, in most places, not all, of course, but in lots of places, you will automatically get trees. To get something of higher value or transitional or meadow, you have to expend effort and money and tend that, and that's rare. So all else being equal, it's about, you know, creating these high quality transitional habitats of different kinds. In a lot of circumstances, you have, say, a schoolyard or a county municipal park where they built in ball fields. They often carve this out of native habitat of some kind. In the East, it's going to be woods. Like, oh, who needs all that woods? We want to put in, you know, 50 ball fields. And then the maintenance people, who are the people to first talk to when you're talking about shifting the culture of how a landscape is tended, so that they're on board with you, is the easiest thing in the world to do is just not mow one mower deck out from all those edges, which are not used for playing in. And that puts you very close to all sorts of seed stock, and a lot of times because the woodlands have been cut, there's sufficient sunlight, and you have this tiny little area of native plants that are sort of squeaking it out at the edges of forests, and then come back and mow that in the at the beginning of the year in spring, and you do that, you know, so basically you're supplying a once a year cut to an area that's not used very much and will be, you know, acceptable to most people as they go along. And it's a huge amount of habitat if you're a tiny little bee-like creature. Okay, this is my last slide. Here is information. You can contact me at the email address. I can send you the resources. They'll also be available through the websites here for the group. We also, all the pictures that you saw, it was mentioned earlier, all the pictures that you saw in this slide presentation and about 4,000 others are available on our Flickr site, and you can download them at the original level. It's absolutely public domain. We don't even want you to ask permission because you have permission, and you can print them out, you can modify them, you can sell them, you can use them in your presentations any way you like. And if you're interested in how we took those pictures, which is sort of a specialized but not super crazy expensive way, because these pictures will blow up to 10 by 12 feet, you can email me and I'll send you a list of links to sort of how-to kinds of things. You can also follow us on Instagram and Tumblr, where I, in addition to showing cool pictures, and we also do plants, I also talk in a blog-like manner about what the species you're looking at are and what their role in the environment is, and tell you kind of cool bee facts. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Wow, that wasn't only like informative, it was just beautiful to look at. So thank you. Let's see what questions we have from the attendees.
Okay, the first question, Sam, is can you clarify the comment that you made that if you are allergic to honeybees or hornets, that if you were to be stung by a bumblebee, you would have no reaction?
Right. So think about it like this. So the problems that things like hornets, yellow jackets, and honeybees have are problems that come about because they have large colonies filled with grubs, lots of grubs in one place. They can't move their colony. The queen is in there, and honeybees have this huge store of honey. And so they have weaponized themselves to repel mammals. And so the venom is designed to be both painful and reactive to mammalian systems, not insect systems. Now, the problem with most of all of our native species is that they're solitary nesters. They aren't going to sting or push back or defend any of their nests. Again, we'll get back to bumblebees. This includes carpenter bees, though, against a vertebrate of any kind. They simply will leave and make a new nest. So their venom is designed against their real problem, which is other insects, which has a completely different physiological system to us. So we don't. Sometimes it's painful, but most of the time it's not. Even if they can sting you, it'd be like the sweat bee situation. Yes, you feel it, but you're not going to the hospital. Bumblebees, it turns out, are colonial. They're only colonial in the year since, and a very large colony can go up to about 400 individuals. Whereas honeybees, you can get colonies that are at one point in time have 50,000 individuals in them. Yellow jackets, some in between thing. So bumblebees, there are no known cases of someone who does not raise bumblebees, which is a thing. So they have these big warehouses full of bumblebees. Those workers over time can become allergic to the stings, but they're exposed to them all the time. There's no known cases of someone getting stung by a bumblebee, like a kid stepping on one in the clover field, which rarely happens anymore because kids don't go outside, and having an allergic reaction. It still can be painful, but that's a different thing. And most of our native bees are not bumblebees and really are so not a sting/allergy threat that most people have no idea they even exist. And they certainly nest in all their yards.
Okay. Next question. Another clarification. To get the widest support for native bees, was what you recommended planting pollen-heavy plants with a variety of bloom patterns?
Was that pollen-heavy, did you say?
Yes.
I don't know what is pollen heavy or not in terms of that's not one of the measurements that we usually think of. So a long bloom period, are we talking about a community of plants or an individual plant species?
I think they were looking for what the community of plants is that you're recommending.
Yeah. So the community should have, and this is a generality, there's no real reason, let's go back up. So North American deciduous forests are a spring bloom forest. In the middle of summer and fall, there's nothing going on there. There are no blooming plants, and so therefore no bees. So there's no right or wrong here. As a general recommendation, it's good to have bloom throughout the year because you'll get to look at bees throughout the year. So in terms of pollen, amount of pollen, that's not something that I think about. I think of, because you can have one plant with tons of floral bloom like a tall goldenrod, and then you can have a lot of small plants like spring beauty where you just have a mass of them. So I think in a backhand way I've answered that question.
Okay. The next, we have a couple of questions about fire. The assumption is, since you use it and you're supporting bees, that there is some benefit to the bees. And the other question is, what is the best timing to not damage any of the young bees?
Yeah, so that's tricky. Essentially, the best timing would be the time that people recommend for the region for taking care of cool season grasses in the east. Now, I think that would go for the prairies, and out west, I'm not quite sure because all those systems are really different. Because most of the bees would have, from the previous year that had nested, will have hatched out and would have started few. Now, would there be a case where some of these nests are destroyed or that there's some bees that have not hatched out? Probably, but that far outweighs the benefits. No, the benefits of burning often outweigh the loss of some of that bee community because it helps flip the competition between the cool season turf grass kinds of things and favors perennials. There's there's a huge, rich history and learning among the restoration groups about when to burn and what, but I would not worry too much about the fact that sometimes you're burning up some bee nests. So first of all, most bees are not nesting in that material. Some do, and they are very common, like serotinas, for example, the small carpenter bees. And then there's a few other mass bees. Those tend to be in pretty good shape. And then almost all the rest of the bees are in the ground, which are just not affected by fires. So I guess my recommendation is not to worry about it too much and look at what's the best time for bringing the floral community that you want to bring back, in terms of burn time. Okay.
And can you clarify that there are no bees overwintering in those perennial stems? Is that what you said?
If you, in year one, so you have a perennial, it's put up a stalks, and then that year, so that winter, there won't be anything in those plants. The second year, so the previous year the plant grew, the second year you or a deer or something has knocked open that stem, and now it's available for bees to access those stems and make a nest. So that year, that plant stem, which is, if we did what I recommended, is only a foot tall, is going to have the nest of bees in it, and it will come out in the third year. So it's really kind of a 3-year process, which is why simply trimming everything to a foot high works, and why actually brush hogging is not a bad thing at all for creating, massive amounts of nesting material for those bees. And if you do that every year, you're really not impacting very much the bee nest. It's not a huge, I just want to emphasize, it's not a huge component of the overall bee environment, and no bee really can access, why can't I get that word right, the plant stems in the first year unless they're broken or cut.
All right. And we have a couple of questions about the timing. One question is, isn't it better to leave the stems up over the winter? You mentioned a couple of different times. Another question is, did you mean March, beginning of March or end of March, or is there some issue with one of the comments is that the Xerces Society recommends cut back not until 50-degree days? Mm-hmm.
Well, so what you do over winter, and now my paradigm is Eastern, and this could hold true for temperate areas in the West too. So there are no bees out in the winter, right? And in terms of the stems that are out there from this current year, there's no bees in them either. So your decision of what to do with those stems during the winter is up to you. So if you're like me, I like to leave them around for a while because the birds come in and it's cover for them and they feed on the seeds, and that's, I think, a positive thing to do. You could have, from a straight bee perspective, in October, you could have just cut that whole thing down to a foot tall, and you effectively have the same number of bees the following year as if you did it in March. So there's nothing going on during that time of year. But so the thing to avoid is really mowing really close to the ground, or trimming out or pulling out all your old stems, because those are the ones that have, so you're going to, if you pull everything out down to the ground, then the nesting opportunity for those few bees that do nest in there, again, the emphasis here, that's not that many bee species that don't obsess about the stem. Just doing cut everything down to a foot tall sometime during the fall to spring period is totally good. You have really small impact either way on your bee community, because your bee community is your soil bee community. That's where most of these species are coming from.
Okay. So when a follow-up question here, so is there any point during the maintenance in the spring that you cut below that 1 foot mark, or are you leaving those 1 foot stalks throughout the season?
Yeah, good point. Yes, you're leaving them throughout the season, because if you cut them below, remember there's a 3-year window when those plants could have bees nesting in them, but and then it's a rolling 3 years, right? Because that perennial is sending up the new shoots in the same place that the old ones are. So yes, everything should be just cut over and over and over again to a foot tall, and the old plant material should be just left, and it will gradually, return to the soil on its own.
Okay, good, thank you. Do you have a recommendation for a book or a resource for bee and plant relationships?
If you go to the website that was listed up there, there's a couple of papers. They're a little bit technical, but I don't think for this group will be too bad. And it has links to the scientific literature on the relations. Otherwise, there's no sort of second level up book where the focus is on these bee-plant relationships, other than getting Heather Harmon's, Heather, I can try and find that. She has a good set of books for the upper Midwest and New England that talks about the plants, and it talks about all bee plants. So it's an excellent reference. But she also mentions which bees and which plants are specialists. So that's the best one in terms of something that's easily accessible. I want to say her last name is Harmon. She's out of Minnesota. Super good book. I can try and track that down and get it to you. Okay,
thank you. This next question is, someone wants to grow a meadow to provide biodiversity and habitat, and their question is this going to attract ticks as well as bees?
Yeah, almost certainly. So, they kind of come with the territory. So one way, a good / bad way to think about this is that when you are managing for bees, because you're managing for things that have flowers, those flowers all set seed, right? And so those seed are going to bring in birds, which are generally seen as good. They're also going to bring in mice, which are generally hosts of ticks. So the answer almost inevitably is yes. And so for tick issues, you can live inside, I guess, or you can manage your deer, and you could have a completely, very low level lawn that attracts nothing. But if you plant flowers of any kind, particularly these native ones, you get mice, and therefore you're going to get ticks if you're in a tick area.
Okay. The next question is about a resource for maintenance for the bee houses. We had a few different questions about them.
So there's quite a lot of online material about mason bees, and includes several books, which I don't have any particular recommendations, because I use bee houses for monitoring and other things. And I really want to emphasize that you can do the maintenance, so you'd have to look that up on your own, but that simply drilling the holes and walking away is a completely good aspect. So I'll take old pieces of wood or logs and other sorts of things, drill a bunch of holes, and then leave them under, you know, in an area that's sheltered from water, and watch them for years and years and years. They'll be reused over and over again by the bees. That flies in the face sometimes of these recommendations from some of the mason bee groups, which are asking you to put in paper tubes, pulling the tubes, cutting them open, you know, selecting out the good cocoons from the bad cocoons. Two things, I just don't see people doing that over the long term. And then it also cuts down on the number of holes that you drill and the kind of access that we would like to see people have to bee watching. And it has very, very limited to nil impact on the, ultimately on the bee populations of a region. Because you just can't, all right, I'll give you one reason I tell this. So we have a way of estimating how many bees are out throughout an entire year. So we did that for the combined area of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And what we estimated was that in a year, this is honeybees plus, which are about 5% of all the bees, and the wild bees, that there's 2.2 trillion bees that are generated just in that small area. So that's like 20,000 bees per acre or something like that. So when you start dealing with a small number of holes, that translates to a small number of bees. The larger impacts of how we treat our landscapes are really the drivers. So whether you have lawns or not have lawns, how you integrate plants into or cultivate your existing native areas is the important thing. And I just don't worry about these things like whether you clean your mason bee nest or not. The impact is just unmeasurably small.
Okay. By another person who's planting a meadow and is talking about keeping the edges cleared, as you mentioned, and a comment from another one of our viewers was, can you recommend the scythe, a manual scythe, for both maintenance and exercise?
Oh, like the old-fashioned scythe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So I have a little collection of scythes that I used to use on my lawn in areas like that. And you know, if you're a scythe fanatic, you want the European hammered-edged ones that they sell online. You can see all kinds of cool YouTube videos on that. But those are mostly for really tame environments, which is, i.e., a lawn or you're sowing your wheat crop, that kind of thing. In the situation that of native plants in fields, and maybe you're sowing once a year, you need what's called the American scythe handle and a brush blade. Okay, so I had all that, and I'm telling you what, you don't want a scythe, you want a weed trimmer with a brush blade on it. And you will do so much more. I know it's more pure to use a scythe, but you will do so much more trimming and maintaining your habitats with one of those that you shouldn't feel guilty about it. That's my suggestion.
Okay. We've had a few listeners send in the name of the book. They believe it was, the author is Heather Holm, Holm, or some have said it's Holmes. One of the books recommended is an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide.
Yeah,
bee.
that's totally who it is. I would get anything she's written. She really has that plant bee thing down on both sides, and her writing style is not technical.
And her website is pollinatorsnativeplants.com.